Ladies and gents, welcome. Up next here in the cathedral, we've got the Gabriel Collective, what we're learning from young adults, fresh expressions of church and the digital space. I'm just going to pray for Rachel and Luke before they begin. So thank you, Lord, for today, and thank you for Rachel and Luke. Just bless them, Lord, as they share their wisdom with us. Amen. So after this session, they will be in the Kemp room for 30 minutes for a Q&A. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Rachel.
It's great to be here on a fantastic day in the cathedral. I thought I would start by giving a bit of an overview about Generation Y. I don't know, some of you are Generation Y. I'm Gen X. Some of you might be higher up than that. You might be boomers, or you might be even the silent generation. So you might know a lot about your world and your generation. But when it comes to young adults, there's quite a big conversation on how we keep young adults in the church, how we do church with young adults. What does young adult church look like? And for any of that conversation, we would need to start by understanding their world, their context, and what it's like to be in Generation Y. You're in Generation Y if you were born from about 1982, then there's a bit of a fudge at that end, no one's completely sure, or around to sort of the mid-1990s, you might slip in if you were born around 2000, but somewhere around there is what we would technically call Gen Y. We also call them the millennials. So I'm going to look at a few of the other names that they have, and why do they have those names, and what does it tell us about them? Have you heard this generation be called Generation Rent? Anyone heard that term? Generation Rent, because they've been formed in a recession from the year 2000. That was quite the year 2000. The recession of 2000 was quite formative for them as a group, and the housing crisis of 2007-8. They're the first generation that is going to be poorer than their parents since data and records began. Yes, they're the first generation that's going to be poorer than their parents from when we first started collecting data and from when records began. Now that is a point of interest. There's a whole pile of things we could go on a little sidetrack with about that. Why is that? Is that a sign of declining culture? All these things that immediately opens in my brain as discussion avenues. But maybe we could do that later. They have student loans, which has left them with debt. They have been priced out of the housing market and often have to live with their parents, which is why we call them Generation Rent. We've had a recession which has brought untold youth unemployment. This generation are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than other generations. They work for less money very often, even though they work really hard. And so they're earning less comparatively for their age bracket than previous generations earned when they were their age. Does that make sense? So they're putting in really longer hours, but they're actually getting back less from the system. There are often things like apprenticeships and interns. I'm sure you've seen a plethora of those kind of things grow up to try to, if you like, spring up around to try to deal with unemployment. And this has obviously had an impact on them. This means they're having to defer their life choices around maybe marriage or children or trying to buy a home because of the pressures, economic pressures. Then they've had the whole threat of terrorism to deal with, the 9/11. They are actually a less optimistic generation. Now, I'd just like to say with all these things, this is like a huge paintbrush. And if you did that for all the different generations that we're with, we can learn things about people as a generation, but it doesn't mean every individual there is like all of them are less optimistic. It means that if you look at them as a whole, if you like, the narrative that comes out of their generation will mean that it's sort of less optimistic than other narratives, so particularly than boomers. So if you're a boomer and you're talking to a Gen Y, you're going to have a very interesting conversation because of just the way you've been formed and how that relates. Therefore, because of terrorism, there's a greater level of fear and anxiety in this group. In fact, 1 in 6 of Gen Ys will experience an anxiety-related condition during their lifetime. 1 in 6 of this generation are likely to have the impact of that they're dealing with, which is higher than other generations. So these are all things that have added a lot of pressure. I've got a wonderful quote here from a Gen Y. I felt an intense, suffocating pressure to achieve everything I want before my youth slips away. 35 has always been my deadline date. And actually, so again, there is a huge pressure. This is partly, we're going to look a bit more at the digital later, but when you can watch everybody else's life, you can really compare. So there are people in this age bracket who will have been thought to have made it because they started a .com company and they're worth a lot and they're changing the world. And that adds a complete increasing pressure on this generation to actually achieve. There's another term that's given to this generation, particularly in Norway. Have we got anyone from Norway? We had some different countries. And this is Generation Serious. Or have you heard the term that's maybe used in America, the New Victorians? Anyone heard that term? That also describes this generation. These are really interesting. The Generation Y are less hedonistic than previous generations. They're sober in comparison. They drink less. That costs more money anyway. That nightclubs have closed. We have probably 2/3 of the nightclubs of London have gone because this generation don't necessarily need to be in a nightclub anymore. In fact, they might choose way over that, a pop-up restaurant that's going to give them a specific food experience. It might look better on Instagram, and they're going to meet more interesting people than they are on a crowded dance floor. And they don't need to go to a crowded dance floor to try and find a mate. They're going to do that through Tinder or through another dating app. I don't have stats in the UK, but in the US, there's a lot less crime amongst this generation. So they're doing less crime. In fact, these are some of these traits which you see, if you want to have a real look at the future, you can have a pop into looking at the centennials who are coming next, and that these traits are going through for them. They're even more sober and even less crime. Very interesting. Less shopping. Who'd have thought a generation would have come who were going to do less shopping than the generations before? And I think that's, again, it's a reaction to consumerism. They're not so interested in success isn't money and possessions. Success isn't money and possessions for this crowd. And so that they're not seen as appealing. They are engaged, this is some of the New Victorian stuff, responsibly through, they like social justice. They want to change the world and the environment. They want to have a big impact in there. These are key issues that if we as the church were leading on, more of this generation, I think, would be interested in what we had to say. We're good at social justice. We need to make that really clear so this generation hears that these are some of the things we're good at. I don't know if any of you have heard Pete Hughes, who's at King's Cross Church, talk about how we may have truncated the gospel. It's a great talk if you can get hold of it. When we just talked about individual, where he loves going right the way through to Revelation into the recreated earth and heaven, because that really appeals to Gen Y because they've got such a care for the environment. They're politically engaged, but 86% of this generation feel that the politicians are out of touch with them. They also have had their future decided for them predominantly by an older generation. This generation would have voted to stay in Europe, and the older generations voted them out. And many of them feel that their future was decided by a generation who will not live to see the impact of that. So Brexit's had quite a big impact. Friends and family are really key and central to them. These are key groups. They relate there, maybe not so much on they wouldn't relate so much to an institution. Things are all done through, if you like, smaller social groups of friends and family. Another term for the millennials is Generation Me, Me, Me. So we've got this consideration that they might be very civic-minded with the New Victorians, but balanced with quite a narcissistic view. They're very self-absorbed, even maybe you could say neurotic and introspective. There's been trends like fit is the new thin. So instead of worrying about being thin, this generation are more worried about being fit. They like to eat well. For example, clean eating is a movement. I've only just discovered that. Clean eating is a movement that's come out of Gen Y. You can look that one up. And a lot of how they decide about things goes through a compass of themselves. It's quite hard to explain this one. So it's not an external force that will help them necessarily decide their morality or the way or their life choices. Particularly the compass comes from inside themselves. The Germans call them Generation Maybe. They think they're a bit flaky. And have you heard the term FOMO? the fear of missing out is particularly around this generation. You know, because if I get stuck into a job, even if it's got great financial rewards, but I would quite like to sort of travel around southern India. So then you trade the job in and then when you're in, you're like, yeah, but I did quite like the job. And so just the commitments can be difficult. So this, you know, with the economic situation that's compounded, maybe marrying, having children, buying houses, you put FOMO with that, it's quite hard to make long-term committed decisions for this generation, which is something that they might struggle with. So how do we engage with this group? Number one, ask a millennial. If you don't know how to engage with this group love to be in part of collaborative leadership. Collaborative leadership is something that they would really like to be a part of. And if you want some really top tips, well, I've done in 2 books. There's a page in this brilliant report by Barna where they put the conclusion right at the beginning. And they talk about how as a church to engage with millennials. Now, not everything in this book translates completely, because I think the US and the UK have some real different trends when it comes to those outside of the church. So the Talking Jesus research that we did when it looked at the under 35s shows quite an openness in this age group who are non-Christian, which is actually slightly different to what's happening in America. But it's got some brilliant things on how to engage with them as church. Cultural discernment. Number one, as churches and Christian leaders and as Christian communities, we need to engage with the culture. And we need to do that with Gen Y, and we need to work out how we do that biblically and communally, and we respond to what's happening in culture. Number two, they need life-shaping relationships. They want, do you know, there's an amazing, they really would like to have more people who are mentoring them through life, who are other generations. And if that happens, they can stay around for longer and form deeper relationships. A first-hand experience of Jesus. Experience is really important. I can't go into the whole of that. There's a brilliant book called How Not to Be Secular that I'd like to recommend by James K.A. Smith. It's a reading of a really big book called Charles Taylor. This helps you understand what's happening with, if you like, the cracks in secularism, where that's happening, and how many of this generation, if you like, they're living in a box that's imminent, and they can they're opening skylights to the transcendent, which is really good for church, because they want spiritual experience, and that's something that we can relate to. Unpack that book on that. So people really want a first-hand experience of Jesus that's really alive. Reverse mentoring. Please value the gifts and skills that Gen Y bring. Please value, they want to work collaboratively in teams in flat leadership. That hierarchy doesn't really work for them, so make it collaborative, but value what they bring. If you value what they bring, they'll help you to reach that generation. And they want to do it vocationally. So they want to also value all the aspects of their life under the call of God, whether they're in fashion or music or a tech startup, see those as calling. And finally, I just want to point out this book. This is a book called Authentic Faith that the Young Adults Round Table did with Fresh Expressions. And again, this has got some key words that we would still reiterate that highlight what we need to look at when we're looking at churches amongst Fresh Expressions among young adults. They would be community, they would be spirituality, authenticity, allowing space for doubt, and that we need to understand that in this world, change is just a constant that you live with. It's just a constant that you live with. And finally, so you need to look this one up, because I'm not going to go through all the details, because you can get it, and it's really slim, and it will help. And finally, in just the last few minutes, I want to talk about one big area that then Luke will back up as we look at the Gabriel Collective. And this is looking at this group generation as digital natives. Give me a quote on that. The computer may have started out as a tool, but it has now filled all the gaps between things, between one place and another, one thought and the next. So it's even filled in the gap between one thought and the next. There aren't so many gaps because we live in a digitally constant stream world. And this generation are the first generation that, if you like, really fascinating for sociologists, because they're the first generation that have been brought up with this constant stream that they have lived in, that even fills the gap from one thought to the next. And this has had an impact on them as a generation, on the way they relate and on the way they view the world. And there's some top things that we've learnt about digital and how to relate through that. So it needs to be interactive, practical, not hype, accessible, collaborative and collective, concise, inspiring, engaging, witty, and please don't bore me. And it needs to be authentic, real, and vulnerable when we use digital. The other thing that this has done, the digital world, has made them a global generation. They are globally connected in a way that none of us could really have dreamt of. You know, where it says the computer has taken the gap out between one place and another. You can be as connected in the digital world to someone on the other side of the globe as you feel to the person sitting next to you on the sofa. Again, it's taken away that gap. So they operate in a global world. And yet it's deeply personal. It's also image-based. Film, not words. And image is so important. Design, image, creativity. I'm going to read you a quote from an artist who's exhibiting in the Whitechapel Gallery near where I live. He says this: "Reality will soon cease to be the standard by which to judge the imperfect image. Instead, the virtual image will become the standard by which to measure the imperfections of reality." Can you hear that switch? And that is fascinating, that actually if you live in a digital world, you can create perfect. And actually you turn around the way by which you judge. He's an artist exhibiting right now in that world. But finally, I want to say there's real hope for us as the church in this age bracket, because we have on offer community. If we do that well, we can have this generation become part of that community and bring their gifts. We do family that could support and go both ways. We have an experience of the real transcendent when we look at the resurrected Jesus Christ. And that smashes through a small, immanent, self-absorbed world and invites this generation to a huge, significant adventure of life, which will need all the gifts that they have to bring with them, so that, if you like, they bring their individuality into community to, yes, change the world, but to do it with others, to rescue the environment, to bring justice, and to usher in the kingdom of God with Jesus. And that is the offer that the church has for this generation. And I think they actually link really, really well, and that there is tremendous hope for us with reaching this generation. Luke.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, great. So let's just click this along one, maybe. Yes, great. So Rachel and I have been doing something very techie and professional for the last year and a half. And we've been trying to engage with people in their 20s and 30s in a way that makes church relevant with them. Rachel's touched a little bit about how more and more of our lives are becoming digital. I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as serious or somebody who drinks less, but there we are. There are more and more ways to interact. There are more and more ways to tell stories using video, Snapchat, YouTube, Facebook Live, Instagram, Vimeo. And more people are sharing their stories online through vlogging. That might be a video about their cat. It might be something to do with their dinner. It might be, I don't know if any of you saw the video of a chap jumping off a bungee thing and dipping a biscuit in a cup of tea. Dunking a biscuit in a cup of tea this week. That's whipped round the internet really quickly. And it's just a story. But what's the best story that we all know? And that's the story about how Jesus has made a difference in our lives. And using video, you can get a really personal kind of insight into somebody's life. And so we wanted to encourage young adults and try and help them think about how they can be contextually relevant with their peers. So because all of their friends are sharing all of these different stories, and we wanted to encourage them and help them share some of their lives in this space, in this medium. And one of the key ways we've been doing that is through the Gabriel Collective. And these are various places you can find us: Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We have a video, which we don't have time to watch now, but you can find it on YouTube, where we meet up around the country. So the first one was in London earlier this year in April. In September, we met in Birmingham, and we've got a couple more as well. The idea is that we gather together as a group of young adults and do a bit of sort of creative video together that then you have something to share. So the video that we might have touched on, but we don't have time, is about generosity. So they just got £20. They went out and overpaid for a bunch of things and then gave the stuff away that they'd overpaid for and had a chance to pray with this woman. And it's just a 3 or 4 minute video about generosity, a concept that everybody understands, but one that's quite central to the biblical story. So actually is then a way into talking with their peers, talking with your peers about biblical things. This is what I did at the weekend. It encourages, so as a collective we get together, it upskills people in kind of how they use their phone to record and create video. It encourages them to become content creators, to share the story of what God has done in their lives. People get involved. We're constantly surprised at how much of a thing it's become. We weren't really expecting that, but it's had a massively positive effect. And that all ties in a little bit to some of the stuff that Rachel was talking about earlier. We're really trying to get people to take these conversations perversely, despite the fact that we've just spent 15 minutes talking about how everything's digital and you can't possibly have an anecdote in the pub anymore because somebody will IMDb it or Google it. Perversely, sharing this content online through social media then we hope encourages offline conversations, because we're not trying to create YouTube stars or people who have millions of followers around the world. We're just trying to help people share that story in a way that makes sense to their friends and then links back, because you can watch a video. It's quite a non-offensive way of engaging with someone's faith, because you can just turn it off if you don't like what they're saying, which maybe you can't do in public. And it might be, yes, thank you, Matt. It might be something to do with how God relates to mental health, or how you experience him through creation. And it makes faith relevant to young adults in their 20s and 30s. So we've got another meetup in London on the 10th of December, which is a Saturday. We're going to make videos about Christmas. If you know anybody that would like to come along, please come and grab us in the Wycliffe. We'd love to have them there. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. And we actually give you the money to go out and do crazy things with as well. The catch being you have to be a young adult. And then we're here in Leicester on the 4th of February, which I'm not entirely sure that I've told the bishop about yet. But we are here in Leicester. So if you would like to come to that, again, grab me afterwards in the Wycliffe, or check us out on one of these ways. Twitter is probably the best one. Hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you very much for your time.
So as Luke says, we'll be in the Wycliffe at past. Let's move this along. Can we have that slide with that details on it? Up next here in the cathedral is Doing a New Thing. What is the Spirit of God doing through the emergence of fresh expression, missional new monastic communities, and how do we respond? That's in here next. Thank you very much. And another huge thank you to Rachel and Luke, please.